Welcome back, everyone. A little Matthew McConaughey there for a minute. Welcome back to Interventions and Detentions. I'm Brad, your host, and today's episode actually comes from something I saw in a social media post here recently, and I thought this could be an interesting topic to talk about. It was actually a question I saw on an educational space online, and it was a simple question, but one that opened up a pretty big door. Is peer mediation effective in a 6 through 8 middle school setting? And I was a middle school principal for 3 short years. I really enjoyed it. Kind of took me out of my comfort zone a little bit, coming from an elementary background, but I did enjoy those 3 years in middle school. And we never really dove into peer mediation a lot. It was a topic we kind of touched on a little bit. So I'm not an expert. I'm going to put that out right now. Not an expert. But doing a little research, a little digging, I thought I could probably talk about this and, give you my 2 cents, I guess. So what we're going to talk about today is peer mediation in a middle school. What works, what doesn't, and what schools get wrong sometimes. As soon as I read that post and thought about it, I thought, this isn't just a yes or no question. Does peer mediation, is it effective in 6 through 8 middle school settings? It's not a yes or no question. It's a leadership, systems, and student development question because peer mediation has been oversold, in my opinion, over the last, probably 10 years, undersupported, misunderstood, and sometimes used as a shortcut instead of a strategy. So today, I want to walk through this in a very real way. Let's talk about what peer mediation actually works for, what it does not work for, why it often falls or fails in high needs Title I middle schools, and finally, how to implement it without setting kids, or better yet, your staff, up for failure. It's not a theory. This is what is lived in middle school reality. And again, not an expert, just going to talk about it. So why schools keep coming back to peer mediation? Let's start here. Why does it keep resurfacing? Because, in my opinion, on paper, it sounds and looks perfect. It seems like a great strategy, a great idea. It builds student leadership, is supposed to, lessen referrals, which saves admin time, and it has kids solving their own problems. It puts SEL into action and incorporates that. And listen, none of these things is wrong. None of them are wrong. The issue is when we expect peer mediation to fix adult problems. Let me repeat that again. The issue is when we expect peer mediation to fix the adult problems. We roll it out because, sometimes our discipline numbers are getting higher. Admin teams are stretched thin, staff are burned out, conflict feels constant. So we think, what if students could just maybe handle this for once? And it's not a bad concept. Like I said, it's an interesting thought, interesting idea, and there's some good and bad things about it. But here's the first leadership truth of this episode and this topic. Peer mediation is not a discipline strategy. It can't be. It's a skill building strategy. When it really comes down to it, the purpose of peer mediation is to build skills in kids. And when schools confuse those two things, being, the difference between a discipline strategy and a skill building strategy, if we confuse those two things and we don't recognize that, the program is going to collapse and fail. It really, truly is. So what peer mediation what does it work for? All right, let's talk about where it really starts to shine, okay? In, a typical 6 through 8 middle school setting, peer mediation works best when the conflict is mutual, the power is relatively balanced between the two individuals, and both students are willing, even at the slightest, to resolve it. They've got to be willing to kind of take that step into that arena of working together to solve and resolve problems and conflict. For example, here's some ideas or topics that may be worthy of using peer mediation. Friendship fallouts, which think about middle school, especially, I'm not going to pick on girls, but I'm going to call it girl drama for a little bit. You always have, 1 week we're friends, 1 week we're not. Drama this, drama that. So friendship fallouts is a good example of where this could work. The she said, he said situations that always are a middle school thing, hurt feelings. Man, middle school kids get their feelings hurt so easily. It doesn't take much. Another good area that this could help in. And rumors. What about rumors? They are rampant in a middle school setting. Social media misunderstandings that haven't really escalated to threats. I think when it gets to threats, peer mediation is not the road you want to go down. But if it's just, well, so-and-so posted this and it hurt my feelings and, just misunderstandings, could be a good use of peer mediation. Lastly, ongoing tension that hasn't turned physical. Again, if it hasn't been a threat, a physical threat, or a physical altercation, I think you're okay with some tension between two students going through a peer mediation process. These are the moments where kids, they don't need punishment. And really in middle school, there's a lot of situations where punishment and consequences are not the answer to the problem and how to, again, resolve the issue. There's situations where there's a need for structure, a need for language and conversation, and a need for time to help things get resolved. Middle school students are terrible at listening without interrupting. They're always in your face. They want your constant attention. They don't have a very long listening span. It's very short, actually. They are terrible at explaining their feelings without attacking or feeling attacked, for that matter. And they're not extremely good at understanding impact versus intent. All right. Peer mediation gives them some things, though, through this process. It gives them a script, because you don't just sit them down and say, okay, work it out. There's something that they have to follow. There's some guidelines and scripting. It gives them a pause, a time to kind of think about, what they're going to say, what they've just heard. And it gives them a neutral space. You're not on one person's turf or the other. And that really helps in that process. It gives them a little bit of ownership. And when it's done well, the success rate for those cases is actually pretty high. But, and this matters, those successes only happen when we are disciplined about what we send to mediation. Again, you've got to be very thoughtful in that process and very selective in the process of when to use this strategy of peer mediation and when not to use it. All right, so we talked about what it works for. Let's talk about what peer mediation does not work for and why this matters. All right, this is where schools get into trouble sometimes when they try this strategy. Peer mediation does not work for bullying. It does not work for harassment. It does not work for repeated targeting, which circles back to bullying. Part of the definition of being a bullying situation is repeated and targeted. It does not work for physical aggression or altercations. It doesn't work for threats. It doesn't work for situations involving fear, coercion, or retaliation. It doesn't work for trauma-based reactions. Okay, those are all pretty severe and major occurrences that two students are not going to be able to work through together on their own, even with a mediator. You're going to need some bigger strategies than peer mediation. And probably some more grown-up help as well. Why? Because mediation assumes an equal voice and safety. And I think that's really important to focus on. Mediation assumes there's an equal voice and it's a safe zone. And in these situations, there's not really that balance there. When we send a bullied student to talk it out with their bully, what are we really saying? What we're really saying is we're prioritizing calm over safety. That's not mediation, folks. That's avoidance, okay? And in high needs, again, I'll call them Title I schools, where trauma is high, instability is high, and power dynamics are real, this line in the sand matters even more. One of the most important lessons for staff is this, in my opinion. Not every conflict is a disagreement. some are harm. Okay, not harmful, but some are harm. And harm actually requires adult responsibility and adult intervention. Now, one thing I do want to talk about and maybe compare for just a moment is a program called Sources of Strength versus what we're talking about today, peer mediation, because I think some people think they're one and the same. And I want to clear up that confusion for a minute, because I think even for a while I thought Sources of Strength was peer mediation because, well, we'll just go into, before I go any further, I want to think about how that comes up often, especially in middle schools. I've heard phrases like, well, we already have sources of strength. Isn't that kind of peer mediation? And I would have said, yeah, kind of. It is. It isn't, but it is. But the answer is no, it isn't. And it really is important that we understand why they are not one and the same. Sources of Strength is an outstanding program. Don't get me wrong. I've seen it used in several schools that I've been in or been acquainted with, let's say. And when it's used the way it was designed, it's a great, great program. But Sources of Strength is not a peer mediation program. It is not. At its core, Sources of Strength is about things like preventing further problems between kids. It's about being mentally health aware and promoting that among your peers. It's about suicide prevention. It's about reducing isolation, students that are feeling alone and isolated. And most importantly, it's about connecting students to trusted adults, because there's a big adult component there too of Sources of Strength. It's not just all about the kids. And that last part matters because Sources of Strength leaders are trained not to solve the problems for the kids. They're trained to say things like, you don't have to handle this alone. That's the move. Peer mediation, on the other hand, is more about that structured conversation, the neutral facilitation, helping two students talk through their disagreement that they're having together and working toward some form of resolution. A different purpose there, different skill sets involved with each one, and different ethical boundaries when you stop and think about it. If you are thinking about it, here's a simple way to think about it. If peer mediation says something like, let's slow this down and talk it through, the adverse of that for Sources of Strength would say, this problem feels bigger than you. Let's get help involved. So schools get into trouble when they blur those roles and those lines between those two strategies and programs. I've seen schools unintentionally put Sources of Strength leaders in situations where they're expected to manage conflict or hold confidentiality or keep an eye on struggling peers. That's not kids' responsibility, folks. That's our responsibility. So let's not blur those lines when it comes to Sources of Strength and peer mediation. That's not what the Sources of Strength program is for. It's not fair to kids when we put them in those kind of situations, especially, again, in our high needs, high risk Title I type middle schools where, that trauma is real and happens more than not. The emotional load of students is heavy and the power dynamics aren't always obvious to see. Sources of Strength intentionally, purposefully avoids these kind of things. It avoids mediation. It avoids confidential conflict resolution. It avoids handling ongoing peer disputes. It's not what it's set up to be. I'm not trying to sell it as this is a bad thing because it doesn't do these things. It's not its purpose. Its purpose is not to mediate. It's not to be confidential in conflict resolution, and it's not supposed to handle ongoing disputes between two kids. Their priority is safety and neutrality. Okay, that's really what when it boils down to it, it's those two things, safety and being neutral. Now, here's the important part. When it is used correctly, Sources of Strength and peer mediation actually work very well together. Okay, Sources of Strength builds that culture. It normalizes help seeking, which is what we want kids to do. We want them to seek out help. And it strengthens adult and student connections, which is huge, especially at middle school when it's all about building relations between kids and adults that can be trusted with the kids. Peer mediation then provides a tool for appropriate conflict. It also teaches communication skills, like let's work and use our words to figure this out, and it helps students practice problem solving skills. Those are real world things that are needed, especially at 13, 14, and 15 years old, folks. One of those strategies helps students know when to talk it out. The other helps them know when not to handle it alone. That distinction is leadership work, folks. That is leadership work in the process. Because when adults are clear about their roles and students are safer and programs actually work the way they're supposed to, that's when good things happen. So let's talk about training for a moment. We said if you're doing a program like Sources of Strength, not only do the kids get trained, but the adults get trained. When we're talking peer mediation, there's a big component of training that needs to happen. You can't just say, hey, we're going to start implementing some peer mediation strategies in our school and either Google it or chat GPT and give you a guideline on how to do it. You need somebody who knows what they're doing, who has led this strategy and this initiative before with success, and lean on them to make this happen, because this is where most programs fall apart, in my opinion. If your peer mediator training is one afternoon or a slideshow, or like I said, a Google chat GPT search, or a certificate and a pizza party, I'm going to guess you don't really have a program, or at least you might think you have a program, but you don't. Really what you have, in my opinion, is a social media photo op, it sounds like. Effective peer mediation training really goes a lot deeper than that. It includes things like how to listen actively, practicing active listening. It will train you on how to use neutral language. Okay. It will train you on managing emotional escalation. It will train you on what confidentiality is and why it's important. It'll show you that knowing when to stop a mediation, and that's important, knowing when to stop a mediation. It will show you role-playing strategies with real middle school scenarios. And it will talk about practicing silence, which is hard for the adults, let alone the kids. But you think about middle school kids and adults trying to be helpful with middle school kids, being silent is a hard thing to do. And here's the big one. Peer mediators must be trained to recognize when mediation is not appropriate. Like we talked about before, you got to know what it works for and what it doesn't work for. This is a safety skill again, okay? The training has to be ongoing. There has to be that initial training, maybe some mid-year refreshers. You got to debrief after mediations to see what you could do better next time and what you better not do next time. And it requires adult coaching, working together. Like, I'm going to help you figure out how to do this better next time. And this is not the set it and forget it list. That's going to be ongoing, all right? There's so many things that can be done to help a program like peer mediation be successful without being a safety risk for you and your kids. Student buy-in is going to be probably the most critical piece in something like this, either working or not working. Will kids either believe in it or will they just roll their eyes? So let's talk about buy-in for a moment. Middle schoolers have an incredible radar for things like fake leadership, adults with agendas, programs that exist to make our lives, the adult lives, easier. So if a student thinks peer mediation is just the admin trying to avoid dealing with the stuff, we talk about the stuff a lot on this program, they'll sabotage it passively or actively. I mean, you may know it, you may not know it, but they'll figure it out and they will crush it to the ground. They'll sabotage it. Buy-in happens when mediators are respected peers, okay? The role is framed as leadership, not enforcement of rules or punishment or consequences. Buy-in happens when students see real positive outcomes. Not necessarily agreed on outcomes, but positive outcomes. for the individuals. Buy-in happens when the program has visibility and credibility. All right, two very important things. I think one mistake that schools make sometimes when they try to implement a program like peer mediation is that they only select the perfect kids, the good kids, the popular kids, things like that. You need to get away from that notion right off the bat. You need to look at different social groups, okay, different personalities, because think about students that are having conflict. They're going to come from different social groups. They're going to come from different personality areas. And, you need to look at students who understand conflict because they've lived it. All right. How important is that? The representation really does matter from all these different areas, okay, especially in these high risk, high need schools. Okay. And I don't want to just keep calling them out, these high need schools. I don't want you to think we're just talking, inner city, poverty stricken schools. High need schools are everywhere. They're rural, they're inner city, they're suburbs. It doesn't matter. And I want to be very clear. In high need schools, which to me, any school is high need these days, peer mediation must be embedded, okay? It can't be isolated. It can't be this thing that's over here and it's there when we need it, kind of like the defibrillator on the wall, okay? It can't be isolated. It has to be embedded and practiced in what you do in your school. And it has to be supported. Again, not just symbolic, like a poster hanging up on the wall with your procedures or your rules or your life skills. It's got to be supported. It's got to be talked about. It's got to be promoted. It's got to be part of your culture. All right. So that means you've got to have clear referral guidelines for one thing. You've got to have adults that can review every peer mediation case that comes to the table. You got to have alignment with social emotional learning, PBIS, restorative practices. All that has to come in line together when you're using something like peer mediation. It's like one package with a nice pretty bow on top. You got to have data to track, even if it's just something simple to let you know, is this working? Is it not working? What are the results that we're seeing and getting? And you've got to have regular adult student check-ins. And I think adult student check-ins is such an important tool that schools don't rely on enough. No matter if it's middle school, primary school, elementary school, high school, check-ins, check-outs are such an easy, free strategy for schools to take advantage of. And again, it comes back to building those relationships and peer trusted relationships with students and adults. That's important, and kids thrive on that. And when you match up people to the right kids to the right adults, amazing, amazing things can happen. So we've got to make sure that we have those regular scheduled adult check-ins with these peer mediation situations to see how's it going? Is it truly still resolved? Is there a conflict bubbling back up to the top again? What's happening here? Most importantly, and what we have to really think about is that peer mediation cannot replace relationships. If students don't trust adults, they're not going to trust the system or the program. And peer mediation works best when adults show up, those boundaries that we set are clear and understandable and attainable, and that safety is the priority. All right. Again, we said this is a safety strategy more than anything else. It's a supplement, again, not a solution. It's a strategy that we can implement and have in our toolbox. All right. So let's reflect for a minute why this matters beyond just the simple notion of conflict. Here's the part that we don't talk about enough, and that is peer mediation isn't really about stopping the conflict. All right, there's going to be conflict. We get one extinguished, let's say, or put out, one fire put out, and two more are going to fire up. Right? It's not about stopping the conflicts. It's about teaching the kids. All right, teaching the kids how to speak to one another, how to listen to one another. Most importantly, how to disagree with one another. As adults, do we all agree with each other? No, we don't. And sometimes we don't even know how to disagree without destroying relationships. But that piece right there, we need to teach kids how to be able to disagree with one another without destroying each other and without ruining relationships. We can The old saying, we can agree to disagree. I know it sounds corny, but it's right. We can. And we have to respect each other's opinions and disagreements to be able to do that and not destroy the friendships and relationships that we have. It's okay. Middle school is where kids start to make some big decisions and draw some lines in the sands. Whether or not conflict equals danger, whether adults can be trusted. You think about that for a minute. That is where it all comes down to it at middle school age. Are they going to trust the adults in their lives or not? And they're going to decide whether their voice is being heard and if it matters. And what better way to do that with peer mediation? When it's done right, again, peer mediation teaches I can be heard without being loud. Okay? I can be heard without being loud. And I can be upset without being unsafe. Big one right there. It's not just a school skill. It is a life skill, folks. It is a life skill. So I really do feel like this peer mediation could go a long way in a middle school situation when it is done correctly and when it is implemented with some training. Not just a half day, not just a slideshow, folks. Ongoing debriefing, professional training development, whatever you want to call it. It is a life skill when we're all said and done. So as we wind this down, is peer mediation effective in a 6th through 8 middle school? We're going back to that original question that I saw in the social media post earlier this week. Is peer mediation effective in a 6th through 8 middle school? I say yes. When it's done with intention, when it's done with boundaries, and most importantly, when it's done with humility, folks. Those 3 things will make it be successful, and it will make it be effective. It is not effective if it's used as a shortcut, if it replaces the adult responsibility in this situation, and it won't work when safety takes a back seat to optics, okay? As leaders, our job isn't to eliminate conflict. Like I said, there's going to be conflict. We will never be able to get rid of it from a school ever. Whether it's kids, whether it's adults, parents, whatever. We're gonna have conflict to deal with, especially our kids. And our job is to help them learn how to deal with conflict. It's to teach students how to navigate it without harm. Remember that word we talked about earlier? Not harmful, without harm. I'm going to leave you with that. Let's learn how to teach students how to navigate conflict without harm. A lot to chew on this week. This is kind of a deep issue for interventions and detentions, but I want to thank you for joining me today and every day. It's always a joy to share some thoughts and some conversation with all of you out there in podcast land. So keep tuning in each week. Again, I love it when you drop by. Share some thoughts on social media. Please, folks, share my page and my podcast with your friends. Have them tune in. Go back and listen to season 1 episodes. Remember, we talked about this last week in our year in review. We've grown a lot. This whole podcast has come a long way since episode 1, season 1, and even the teaser before episode 1. Whew, rough, but it was fun. And fast forward to a year and a month later, and here we are. This is season 2, episode 18. We're hitting close to 20 here soon. We've got some more fun guests lined up here in the next few weeks, so stay tuned. Keep tuning in. This is Interventions and Detentions. I'm Brad. Thanks for listening. And as always, this is where the real learning begins. See you next time.